Speaker for tonight, Ms. Claire Myhill, who's a counseling psychologist who completed a training at the University of Pretoria. Since qualifying, she has spent several years working in private practice and on the team of a Johannesburg-based addiction rehabilitation facility. She spent her childhood in relatively high-performance settings, whilst also overcoming several physical challenges, so learned about performance enhancement and building resilience from a young age. Instead of just coping with setbacks, she found ways to grow and thrive, and regards this as one of her greatest strengths. Her personal challenges and professional interests have led her to develop knowledge and insight into chronic pain, addiction, as well as how to help people dealing with anxiety and depression more generally. She also focuses on helping people enhance their performance and achieve their goals through sports psychology and leadership development strategies. I'm going to hand over to Claire now for the session. I encourage all to please sit back, relax, and enjoy the session. Be ready with your questions for our Q&A session after Claire's presentation. Over to you, Claire. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. So lovely to be here with all of you tonight. I hope that you are well, and I hope you're not in too much pain. I hope that's not the reason that you've come to join us, but if it is, I hope that you will find some valuable insights from what I have prepared to share with you today. So I'm just going to open it up on my side. Okay. So, sorry, just a little bit. Okay, perfect. Can you see the presentation? Just let me know if there's any problems with seeing the slides on the screen.
All clear, Claire. You can go ahead.
Perfect. So as the advert kind of described, we are here to talk about mental health and chronic pain. Two sides of the same coin, very much, in terms of the physical and lived experience of dealing with something like chronic pain. Let's do a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, and then we can kind of get stuck in. So basically, other than I do want to give you a little bit of an introduction about me in terms of my journey, and a little bit more in terms of what the description at the beginning kind of alluded to with my physical challenges when I was younger, because I think very much, that was probably like the big kickstart of my journey that probably led me to psychology in the last place. And I've spent a lot of time learning about the human condition, pain, but I think very much, because I also was once in the shoes of somebody really experiencing some difficult things within my body, so I think rather than only referring to like the textbooks, which I have definitely also referred to in preparing for today, I do also want to just make it a little bit more human by, kind of touching on how some of these things manifested. So I'm really hoping that after today, you'll have an understanding. I think we all kind of know what pain is, but it is also quite a subjective experience. So I'm just going to define it first. Then we will just touch on briefly the role of the brain in pain. The brain is a very significant part of the brain, the whole, central nervous system, and the way that we perceive, everything going on inside and outside of our body. And then also looking at the purpose of pain. There is actually a very functional reason that we experience pain. We wouldn't want to not have that experience, although obviously it can sometimes get very overwhelming and inconvenient. So yeah, I'm going to define that, look at the types of physical pain that we might get, because they, I think that those they can manifest in slightly different ways in our experience, looking quickly at how we experience it in our body, kind of how those messaging systems kind of occur, without getting into too much kind of detail. I'm not a biologist or a doctor, but from the knowledge that I have in mental health, as a psychologist, I have studied neuropsychology and things like that. So drawing on some of those things. Then I also want to look at neuroplasticity. I will explain what that means. It's a big word, but it's a really important word to understand in terms of pain, because as much as there are some challenges to overcome and they can be quite compounding, the fact that we have a neuroplastic brain is very good news, because it does mean that there are some solutions and there's some hope. Why do we need to actively manage pain is going to be our next touching point, as well as the impact of pain, and then considering why it is so difficult to manage, because it's not a straight shoot kind of situation. Unfortunately, there are, you know, a lot of obstacles and there's reasons why. So we can just kind of define some of those briefly and then look at how we can manage pain. So I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible in terms of the overview and then kind of really getting into as many of the practical tools as possible. So as I said, you know, just very, very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on boring me because you are here to hear about what I have to say and share. But just to clarify, I suppose, in terms of my credentials in understanding pain, my journey started when I was about 11. I was diagnosed with scoliosis. If you're not familiar with that, it's a curvature of the spine, and there's an implication in terms of the nervous system, and basically kind of set off several years of back bracing and a lot of, you know, intervention to try and correct the problem. We got somewhere, but then my, you know, life doesn't always go smoothly. So unfortunately, I had to have spinal fusion surgery at the age of 17. That was quite challenging. It was in Trick, but thankfully with a really, really incredibly supportive family and school and system, I got through that, managed to get to university. But for the next few years, when I was supposed to be like, you know, corrected and the pain was supposed to have been resolved, I landed up having a lot of complications, and I just lived in just very high levels of pain for about 2 or 3 years. And we had done a lot of investigations, x-rays. I think this is the part where, you know, some of the compounding effects, because there were some, you know, professionals that just did not understand where the pain was coming from, like they couldn't find a source. And then after about 2.5 years, they did find the problem. There was a complication there was metal titanium in my back that had been part of the fusion, and there was a problem in it. So the whole structure had been moving in my back for about 3 years. It was relieving, to say the least, to find the problem and fix it. And then subsequently from that, it's just been many, many years of rehab and, you know, going through studies, having kind of nerve problems, stress injuries. You know, it's the kind of thing that I now have to manage. And yeah, there has been several kind of knock-on effects in terms of, you know, mental health. I might touch on, you know, some of those as well, but that's really kind of the context that I come at it from. At the same time, I did a lot of ballet and dancing, so I really also understood quite a lot about the body, and I think that was also like it was challenging, but it was also probably a very helpful thing because it kept my body strong and flexible, and it meant that I could kind of weather some of the things ahead. And I think the combination of those lessons really also served me in terms of coping strategies and understanding how to actually function in the context of having, you know, pain that's out of your control. So without further ado, let me get into the definition of pain. What is pain? So not all pain means the same thing. We can sometimes experience pain from the context of, you know, like something being very, very wrong in our body. You know, it's a very subjective thing for most people. So someone might have a cold and find themselves very unable to function properly, and somebody else might be able to push themselves to a very high threshold before they really, you know, struggle. We can also kind of define the difference between acute pain and chronic pain. Sorry, just one sec. Acute pain would be more kind of extreme, intense, quick pain that often is kind of an indication of an injury or a problem that needs to be attended to, whereas chronic pain can be ongoing. It can be something that is, you know, a symptom of many different conditions we might experience. And those are the kind of, by implication, it doesn't always mean that there's a cure for those kinds of pains, and they need to be managed in a gradual way. We can also consider that sometimes there is a medical origin. So sometimes there is a problem in our body and we need to go to a doctor and, you know, get medicine or have a surgery. Other times there might be pain related to like a psychological origin, which doesn't necessarily mean it's in our head. That's not at all what it means, but it means that we might have tension from, you know, being anxious, like headache tension, that kind of thing. And then there are kind of quite a lot of knock-ons that can also, you know, be caused by psychological origin. For example, a lot of autoimmune disorders, you know, are very like impacted by stress. Physical versus emotional. You know, I think it is, as much as we are like a lot of people might, you know, kind of attribute chronic pain to physical pain. I do think that it is important to note that emotional pain can also be very distressing, and it can be something that greatly impacts somebody's life. So whether it is purely physical or there is an element of emotional pain, I think a lot of the principles here apply. And then, yeah, we have also an emotional interpretation of pain that can sometimes really compound things. So even if we do have a physical origin, there can also be this knock-on effect from the psychological side. Then in terms of the body and mind, I do just want to clarify as well that we don't necessarily see these things as like purely distinct. You know, some of the things that we consider emotional can kind of be in, you know, in our bodies, We can kind of experience, stomach symptoms, and that's related to, sort of mental health and anxiety. So I wouldn't necessarily want to see those things as purely separate, like health and mental health. I think, it's about understanding our holistic body and the human, condition of having a body that we do. And then, those two things also very much impact each other, as well. Like we can invest in one or the other for the betterment of the other. So then, just also to clarify that we are going to be touching on some of like the neuropsychological dynamics, some of the, as I said, the brain and the nervous system, the way that they communicate to, coordinate our response basically to pain. Some of that's, subconscious, unconscious responses. And, hopefully over time we can become more conscious in our response and change our relationship essentially with our pain. And then lastly, on this point, we want to really understand also the physiological dynamics and learn to read those signals accurately in terms of that relationship. Coming to the brain, so our brain, to say the least, is incredibly complex. I think we're still learning so much about it, as we in the scientific profession, in the psychological profession. So, definitely there's no ways that I'm going to get through the complexities of the brain in this, very brief engagement. But basically, our brain interprets information from all of over our body. We've got nerve endings everywhere. It tells us what's going on in our temperature. It tells us what's going on internally. Proprioceptors, all kinds of, different information that kind of basically helps us function and perform on a daily basis. This is a two-way communication. So our brain also then kind of, distributes our response and, through our behavior, our thought patterns, that kind of thing. So it's definitely a two-way connection. Different brain regions are linked to different types of pain. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this because I think there are more important things. I will cover kind of two really key sort of areas of our brain a little bit later, but just suffice to say that there are different brain regions that govern different things and kind of interpret different types of pain. So if we do have kind of brain injuries, that often also can then impact our bodies in different ways. The role of perception and interpretation is very important, and essentially what that means is that our experience of pain only really lands when it reaches the brain. So, if something happens in our body and for some reason the signal doesn't reach our brain accurately, we're not going to actually experience pain in the same way. For example, when someone's under, anesthetic, general anesthetic, we don't feel that because our brain's not perceiving it. Even though our body can sometimes still, remember the physical trauma, as I can relate to. And then, there are various aspects of pain perception. Basically, all of these three things we can't really separate out as well and say this is, the sensory stuff and be very distinct about it. They have a very strong interplay with each other. They can compound and impact, for example, like the emotional can impact how we sense things. But basically, we've got, our sensory system, like our nerves and our body, our sense, our five senses are kind of the basic level we often get taught, but basically every single, part of our body, there's sensory information being, sent to our brain. Cognitive evaluation, so how we interpret it, our thoughts about it, whether we, when we experience pain, whether we go something along the lines of, I don't think I can handle this, or like, okay, it's like, this is really bad, but I've got this, I'm okay, I'm safe, I'm not actually in danger. Affective motivational is really our emotional state, and that emotional state can also very much impact how we perceive the pain. So if we are having a really good day, we might handle it better. If we're having like the worst day, everything's gone wrong, and and that might cause a headache in itself, but we might react in a much more intense way to kind of a painful stimulus if we are just feeling very burnt out. So and I will touch on a little bit later that we do kind of have three sort of distinct physiological states that often really have a huge impact on that. Very big complex interactions between these variables. You can't separate any of those out in terms of understanding pain. So what is the purpose? Does sound a bit weird to talk about the purpose of pain when for a lot of us we want to get away from it, but we do need to understand that it is unpleasant, but it's inevitable. It's part of being a human being, and it's also what keeps us alive. So, whether you subscribe to the idea that, we were created, or whether you believe in evolutionary theory, or you believe in a combination of the two, the point is that our brain is unbelievably designed or evolved to keep us alive. It's the reason why we're on this planet and listening to this presentation right now, is the fact that our brain, detects threats in a very instinctive, very quick way, and will kind of respond accordingly if it believes the situation to be a threatening life or death situation. So kind of similarly to like responding to a lion, or if someone, wants to harm us, we're going to go into basically fight or flight mode. If we experience pain, if we've had an injury in our body, that's there to kind of attend to it so that we can go get treatment, that we can heal from it, that we don't get an infection by just ignoring this cut that we've got on our body. So as much as it's inconvenient, it would be much worse if we didn't actually experience that pain. And there's actually research on like children who have conditions where they don't experience pain. And it's very, very, upsetting because they land up breaking their bones. It's very difficult when they actually don't have those detectors. Another kind of metaphor we can look at it as is kind of an engine light, like when your car engine light goes on, you get it to the mechanic, if, as soon as possible, preferably, or it's probably going to break down. Why don't we do this with our bodies? Not all of us do. Some of us do, but that's, pain really can indicate that. But there are a few kind of provisos to that, and I will kind of get back to that in a little while later, because sometimes we are seeing a lion and it's actually not a lion, and that can obviously be a problem in our response. Sometimes there's miswiring in the electrical system. So we've got to understand that just because we are detecting the threat does not always mean that the threat is a life and death situation, even though our body might react that way. So basically, it's our body's defense mechanism. It's a way of keeping us alive and helping us through life and death situations, basically in an instinctive way. So it acts as a signal or a message that we're in danger, that we might have experienced harm, or that we might come to experience harm. It's a reflex, and basically it's designed to help us avoid the danger again in future and make us adjust our behavior. So in other words, if you burn yourself, you are going to probably learn a tough lesson and not touch the thing that burned you again. However, just as a very quick thought experiment, I know that I can't get a response from everyone, but I want you to just, try this with me now, just to illustrate what I mean. And it is a terrible time of day to ask this question. So I want you to imagine that it's like basically any other time, 11 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the middle of the night, and I had to ask you this question. Are stoves hot? And most of you would say yes. Most of you at any time of the day, if I said, are stoves hot, you would say yes. And the reality is that they sometimes are hot. And when they are hot, we need to be very careful of that because they can burn us. But if we are, at any other point in the day, like we will still probably remember that. But actually, like statistically, the odds of all the stoves being hot in the country are very, very low. So, we are generally going to remember like the worst case scenario, and that might, be. It may or may not be relevant to the actual like threat, the present threat. So hopefully, we take action, we get treatment, we get support. That's kind of the goal of experiencing pain and kind of processing that pain and contextualizing it. But at the same time, something like uncertainty is always going to be a little bit of a threat. So in other words, the subjective experience of pain, if we don't know where the pain's from, that in itself can be, kind of a scary and threatening thing. And what I mean by that in terms of my example of an unknown snake, and I think unless you are like the biggest snake expert in the world, if I were to just chuck a snake at you, you're not going to just calmly go, like, let me just not overreact. Let me just check if the snake is actually going to hurt me or not. No, you're going to like jump up in an instinct, get the snake away from you, and then you might, when you've like had the the time to calm down, then you might find out if it's a poisonous, dangerous snake or not. So in the case of uncertainty and threat detection, we when we don't kind of have like the ability to really check out the extent of it, we can often react that way. So trauma is often stored in our body. So, when we've gone through difficult, stressful, traumatic things, it can have a real physiological effect. So sometimes we do have like an injury, and sometimes we have a very physiological experience when we've experienced something very stressful. And that also, by the way, that storing in our body and how that can sometimes lead to things like chronic pain and autoimmune conditions can also have a generational element to it. There's a lot of research that there are, sort of certain things are handed down, genetically. So we've just got to bear in mind, and that we see this, in family histories and things like that. Sometimes I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to get further into that one. But yeah, we just need to know that there's a lot of complexity here. Just wanted to show you this one. I subscribe to cognitive behavioral therapy as one of my main kind of focuses in therapy. And this is one of my favorite models, to use the risk resource model. I've put the word anxiety there, but, it's basically that response that we have, and that threat detection system, to our pain. And yeah, as I said, sometimes we overestimate that threat. So sometimes we feel pain and we respond in a way as if it is a lion, but it's just a little kitty cat. The shadow looks like a lion, but it's going to scratch us, not actually kill us. And sometimes, unfortunately, and I think this is kind of where anxiety disorders and things like that come in. We might be seeing a lion, but there isn't actually anything there. We might be fearing the lion that we're imagining in our mind. And I don't want to necessarily say that it's like in our head and it's a paranoia thing, but it's more that our thoughts and the way that we interpret things can kind of blow things out of proportion sometimes. So we might not necessarily be, there might still be a danger, but it might not be like a 10 out of 10 danger. We can also, build in resources, and that's kind of really my focus a little bit later on, hopefully, is adding in some resources once we've kind of contextualized this kind of threat, of pain a little bit more. I'm very quickly just going to show you this. This is basically just like the different types of pain. We've got injuries. We would have kind of somatic pain, which would be, when there's something that's kind of really impacted your body, an injury, that's kind of localized. Visceral pain could be like more internal, like organs, like if you've just got like a pain in your body somewhere, more general. Neuropathic pain is when it's kind of in our nerve system. So it's like nerve damage. Something that I know, and that's something that I can relate to. I had a lot of my stress injuries kind of meant that I lost a lot of functioning in my arms at certain points when I was really, doing a lot of work. And similarly, I've also heard cancer patients really struggle with this. Like it can really cause a lot of nerve damage. There's a lot of conditions that cause neuropathic pain or nerve damage. Then we've come to inflammatory pain. So that's kind of when someone's got conditions like arthritis or IBS. And it's kind of an inflammation response in our body, which makes us a bit more sensitive to pain. So some people live with chronic conditions along those lines, and it kind of exacerbates, and it's kind of your nervous system becomes sensitized in an unfortunate way to the pain that you experience. Then we get psychogenic pain, which is very much a psychological origin, but then, so not necessarily like a medical, like muscle tension, headaches and things, but it can very much be, just as real and present in our body, even if that is the case. So how do we experience it? Like, how does it actually like move through our body and kind of reach our brain so that we experience it? I'm also going to run through this quite quickly because I think there are very important things to get to. Basically, looking at like the peripheral ways that our senses and our nerve endings and our skin, transmit these signals. If you get a scratch on your skin, that's going to be where it comes from. We'll send that information to your spinal cord, which will, take it all the way up through your cord to your brain. And then that will distribute it to the correct centers that will interpret the different types of pain. That information will give, a little bit more detail, to your brain around the location, the intensity of the pain. And then, so to send it to the correct brain region. The brainstem very much modulates this. Brainstem is very important in understanding kind of the experience of pain. It modulates the signals, and then it also, basically the descending pain modulation system is the other way that the brain communicates then with the rest of our body to respond to the pain, and also actually has an effect to sometimes amplify the pain. So, that kind of also relates to that third type of pain I was referring to in terms of like the inflammation and in our central nervous system that can, very much be, like the way that we, and it can amplify it. It can also, by the way, increase pain-killing neurotransmitters. So things like, I can't remember what the exact word is, but like there's an analgesic effect essentially when, when we've kind of we can dissociate from the pain. So our body does actually have some incredibly interesting natural painkillers that we can, activate in certain conditions. Then the next sort of part of it, so that's kind of once it's reached the brain, once we've got this pain in our brain, we get, it basically distributes it to the thalamus. So I know it's a little bit technical. I promise it's going to get a lot less technical from here. And then that will send it also to our higher cortical areas, which is a lot of like our, very much like, higher processing areas. those three cortex, or yeah, those three that don't have bullet points, unfortunately, but they should. The somatosensory cortex is very much really what will kind of help us decide like the location and intensity of the pain. The insula and ACC are kind of about emotion, integrating it in with like the sensory and emotional aspect. So kind of that's where the interpretation of our pain comes in. And those are the areas that I'm going to come back and touch on a little bit more. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex. So that's kind of very much our rational thinking brain. It's how we interpret things. It's often where our active thoughts come from, is our prefrontal cortex. And that's where we kind of appraise things, modulate things, and we can also regulate from that part of our brain, our attention. That's kind of where we anticipate things. So we might anticipate pain, which could either exacerbate it or not. And, drawn on from our previous experience. So that's kind of where, if we've burnt ourselves on the hot stove, our body will try and, remind us that we burnt ourselves on a hot stove and please don't do that again. One last thing, we've got neurotransmitters that are involved in a lot of this processing. So things like serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, endogenous opioids. That's the one that helps modulate the pain and kind of dulls the pain under certain circumstances. So yeah, we basically, and those can affect both, within the brain and within like the spinal cord itself. The insula, as I said, was just one of the areas I wanted to touch a little bit more on. Basically, it's a part of our brain that's in our cerebral cortex, and that is, very much a crucial role in the way that we process a lot of sensory experiences. So how we perceive pain, it really interprets the pain from different parts of the body, integrates this into kind of like the story we would kind of tell of our pain. So very much involved in the story that I told you at the very beginning there. Emotional response to pain, also very much the way that it impacts us in terms of the amygdala. That's the other section I'm going to get to in a sec. And then, helps us modulate the emotional responses we have to our pain, including whether we feel distressed by it, whether we feel fear for the future by it, or vulnerable, whether we feel anxious, or develop other kind of physiological dynamics such as depression. Excuse me. And then the autonomic responses is also really, really critical. That's kind of our sort of regulation system. So that's the part of our body, or the part of our brain at least, that will kind of manage our heart rate, our blood pressure. It will make us sweaty. So kind of very much that fight or flight response that's in our autonomic nervous system. And that can be very much affected by the experience of pain. And then it also coordinates the physiological responses to painful stimuli. So if we've been hurt, it will help us run away from it if it's something that is going to continue to try and hurt us. And if we are very badly injured, it will also have a different physiological response. Pain modulation as well, and I think that word's come up a few times, that biomodulation, in terms of the perception and the connections in terms of other brain regions, and the way that they process the pain. And then looking at the way that, again, that sensitivity and intensity of the pain that we experience. The amygdala is very much, it's a little part of our brain that is hugely implicated in our emotional experiences. It's in our temporal lobe. It helps us process emotions, especially fear, anxiety. So there is actually like research with people who've experienced a lot of chronic stress and things like that their amygdala can actually be quite enlarged. So there can actually be a physical process and a physical change in terms of our experience of things like pain and stress. Our amygdala also modulates the perception and influences how we interpret pain. I'll get into that a little bit further down, but basically also a bidirectional modulation. So in other words, it will receive information, and then it will also distribute information to the body in terms of how we interpret and kind of, the intensity of pain will very much be impacted by that. So integrating the sensory, emotional, and cognitive information to really, create our subjective experience. So it receives sensory input, from the thalamus and the sensory, somatosensory cortex, and then, basically, the emotional processing, the prefrontal cortex and the insula that I mentioned just now. Cognitive regulation, that's very much like the thinking part, the way that we think, how that really impacts, our experience, our higher order kind of cognitive processes, like, our attention, There are certain cognitive skills that we can learn to regulate and kind of manage our attention. So that can be a huge way that we change our relationship with pain in terms of our expectations. Sometimes literally be like, I think that like there's if you fall, apparently, like if you tense yourself, like it can create more injury actually than if you don't. So yeah, like the role of anticipation and muscle tension and things like that. And how we like appraise threats and things, and whether they are external or internal to our body, those very much modulate our pain perception, and really interpreting its significance. The amygdala also enhances the emotional and affective components of pain, very much evaluates pain-related threats, modulates those emotional responses, and then regulates our pain sensitivity in different contexts. So, and that might be that. So we might be able to handle more pain in some contexts than others in different, situations, with a lot of different variables being included in that. So in other words, in a safe space or not. It can also inhibit that pain perception. So that's where, if pain's not perceived as threatening, if we learn to kind of live with our pain, if we learn, and that's really important for people experiencing chronic pain, is, learning to increase our window of tolerance, learning to, live a little bit more and effectively through different coping mechanisms, as well. And then, sometimes it can also be like a stress-induced analgesia. So that's basically, when we are kind of like overwhelmed to the point that we actually kind of get a bit numbed to the pain itself. And that's also a protective mechanism. But that can also become problematic and maladaptive when we get stuck in that space. So let me get on to the next thing. So basically, neuroplasticity, as I mentioned, is just really an important way to understand, the fact that as much as a lot of these things that I'm talking about are related to pathways in our brain, the way that our brain is wired, and we can, our brain becomes wired in a certain way when we respond to pain in a certain way. If we respond in an avoidant way, it gets wired accordingly. So basically, through those transmissions and those signals, and then how our brain processes and then perceives those signals and our thinking patterns. All of those things are what we refer to in those pathways. In the cortex, in that part of our brain, those signals from our nerves are processed and integrated into other, and we basically like combine that then with the emotional cognitive to create that subjective experience. Our brain also has a lot of mechanisms for modulating the perception, as I said before, inhibiting or amplifying it. And the descending pathways from that, the brainstem is really a huge area where that is implicated in, and that's where a lot of our regulation of pain sensitivity and intensity comes in. Maladaptive plasticity, so that's kind of when we've developed ineffective coping strategies, ineffective defense mechanisms that have kind of become new problems in themselves, and that's where chronic pain can actually become worse sometimes. When we highly focused on it, we can really compound the effect. So even though there might be an original kind of, causative effect and point of our pain, we can really, create these vicious cycles sometimes in the way that we respond to it. The central nervous system very much, they're amplifying our pain signals, but we can also very much adapt. So the whole point of plasticity is that we can build new pathways. So we can respond to chronic pain conditions differently. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have any pain. It doesn't cure our pain, but we prevent ourselves from compounding it. And basically, it can mean that we can live happy and meaningful lives, even though we accept that there is the presence of our pain. So those kinds of things will change our neurocircuitry, the connectivity, all those things that we were referring to in terms of our neurotransmitters, those chemicals in our brains very much. We can learn to do things to release different chemicals as well. So why do we need to actively manage it? Basically it can be, as I said, made worse, exacerbated by the way we respond, the way we think, if we catastrophize, if we avoid it. And a very good example is if we have like a sore tooth or something that we just, we avoid going to the doctor, we avoid going to the dentist, and then by the time we actually do go, it's actually so much worse. So it can be something as simple as that. But at the same time, like every time we do avoid something scary, like a threat, a pain signal, we actually also reinforce this message that it is bigger and more problematic than it is. And we reinforce the view that we can't actually handle it. So that does kind of really shape our reality in a huge way. So no matter what the initial cause is, understanding that like pain in our bodies is really important. I'd really recommend if this stuff is interesting to you, there's so much more incredible stuff out there. Please don't take my word for all of this. Like, to really take back our lives, there's incredible advancements all the time in terms of managing pain. So it can create a lot of complications. It can affect our mental health and functioning, which can create more pain, and they can really become a bit of a spiral effect. We need to be very mindful of the impact of our pain on our mental health and well-being, which can then further, impact our pain levels. And also, by the way, like this might be relevant for you, but it's also important to just note this, if you have loved ones who are experiencing chronic pain, if you've got clients who are experiencing pain, that some of these things are, might not be as directly applicable to you right now, but, having kind of empathy and understanding for what people are going through is a really, really important, part of the journey. So especially when that pain is linked to chronic conditions, we might find ourselves, just very exhausted and dealing with these vicious cycles, and that exhaustion can just also make it a lot harder. So one of my favorite quotes when it comes to pain, and this is a man that is also doing some incredible work, is just to sum all of that up, that the attempt to escape from the pain is what creates more pain. Even though it is an instinctive thing, even though it's kind of what our body wants to do naturally, we do sometimes need to rewire it and kind of take over the driver's seat and help ourselves respond differently. So just to very briefly cover some of the stress and trauma kind of impacts of pain. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these things. It's just kind of possibilities. Not everyone will experience this stuff, but, people can, experience it as very traumatic sometimes, very stressful. I had, probably one of my most painful traumatic experiences was one of my surgeries. I actually woke up before they'd administered the painkillers, and my whole body went into shock, so there can be a range of different traumas that people experience, and not everyone will experience PTSD. It's not an inevitability, but, PTSD can be a complication, and it doesn't always mean like remembering it in like detail and having these flashbacks of that moment, but it can be remembering in our body, remembering a feeling, remembering, different things that make us bring back that feeling of unsafety in our body. There can be a huge financial implication. And I think that's probably one of the things that people who don't experience pain and deal with conditions don't always see, is that it really drains your finances. That you don't necessarily want to, put all this money into your health, but it's kind of a grudge purchase that you have to sometimes make. If you're lucky enough to have the resources as well. Not everyone always has those resources available. It can be taxing to get to appointments. There's just so many impacts that really cause just a lot of stress. People with chronic pain deserve medals. Basically then the social impact. So there's like two sides of the same coin. I find often is either the invisible and like silent impact that that's probably one that I can relate to, because most of my conditions are invisible. Like no one can really see it on my body. You wouldn't know that it's been through it if you look at me. So like it can sometimes feel very misunderstood, to have to go through something that no one can see or experience or understand. On the other hand, you can also have an obvious impact to people. I mean, as much as you can't see how from my general form, I've got a very long scar down my back, and a lot of people might respond to that. So people have disabilities that can then have a different impact on yourself and make you feel very self-conscious if it's obvious to other people that you're struggling. So both of those things can be very hard. There can be isolation because people, don't understand it. You can feel like a burden as well and kind of, take yourself out of situations. So there's a lot of different types of isolation that can happen. Yeah, impacting your self-esteem and trust. The word trust is basically referring to the fact that in terms of our mental health, if we're experiencing anxiety or depression, that can really affect the way we think. It can affect how quickly our processing in our brain happens, and that can really lead us to doubt ourselves. So that is another source of some of those vicious cycles and knock-on effects really, happening. And then, medical response trauma being dismissed. As I said, I experienced this all too well. People just, diagnosing me with this. I had a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, so that's also another fun experience that I can relate to. There's a lot of different things that, some people can really have to fight to be taken seriously, and that can be very traumatic in and of itself. Just want to also clarify, the role of exhaustion. Basically, like it's something that Spoon's theory is something that we can refer to here, which is essentially that chronic conditions can mean that we wake up with different levels of spoons at different moments. So sometimes you wake up with 4 spoons and you can get a whole lot of stuff done. Sometimes you wake up with 1, sometimes you've got none. And it can be very, that in itself can be stressful to be inconsistent like that, even though you might absolutely be doing your best. And Spoon's theory kind of means, trying to, negotiate life in a way that is manageable for the amount of spoons that you actually do have, which is also not necessarily something that is always, it's easier said than done. It can be relentless. So I think that's also one of the things, with chronic pain is your body is, you can't really escape it. It goes everywhere with you. So you kind of have to find a way to make peace in some way, shape, or form, within your body, ideally, because you're not going to get you're stuck with it, unfortunately. And that's something that I can really relate to, is really, coming to love and appreciate my body even when it lets me down. So our relationship with our body and our mind, is so incredibly important there. And that's not going to be a perfect thing. Like, I think there's a lot of stuff on social media that kind of implies that we should always be positive, and I don't think that that's realistic. So, allowing ourselves to be human beings is a big part of that. And then, mental health challenges. I'm going to get into kind of, the 2 sort of main ones that come up. There's a lot of other, things that we would refer to when we talk about like mental health, even though I don't like to distinguish that too much. Basically anxiety, the role of avoidance. The more that we run away from the threat, the bigger it gets. And learning to kind of sit within our anxiety and respond to it in healthy ways and proactive ways can often also then, impact the patterns and the way that they unfold. I do have a few CBT resources that I also just want to quickly touch on as well. And the other thing with anxiety as well that's really important to, recognize, and there are sort of different effects of depression, is that it can lead to sort of further physical symptoms. So a lot of things like in the digestive system, ulcers, heartburn, IBS, those things are actually, very much about the way that our body responds to fight, being in fight or flight mode. Those, our digestive system gets deprioritized. Our frontal lobe gets deprioritized because our blood is pumping to our muscles to help us run away from this lion. And if there is no lion and, or no present life and death threat, it's not very, convenient, but it still has that, that same kind of effect on our body. Autoimmune disorders and things like PCOS also have a lot of like links to stress and, trauma and things like that. And anxiety in our body very much can have knock-ons there. Depression as well. Depression I would see, as kind of like it's not necessarily the same as being sad. Sometimes people feel very numb when they are depressed. But that's kind of a further emergency sort of state in terms of us being a little bit more shut down from an energy level. I'm going to just show you a quick model that really I love to explain some of these things. It's not a perfect science. It's basically polyvagal theory, which some people, ascribe to more than others. But basically, I think it's just really important to understand. And these things aren't necessarily the same as saying, being in fight or flight is the same as being anxious, and being kind of in freeze mode is the same as being depressed. It can be a lot more complicated than that, and we can be in these different states at appropriate times. They can be very normal, when we are in danger to be in fight or flight. When we're angry, we're kind of activated like that. And then when we are, grieving, when we are, really badly injured, something like that, when we're burnt out, we might experience a little bit of that freeze kind of dynamic. But when we get stuck in those spaces, we might land up going to a doctor who might diagnose us with something like anxiety or depression. And the fun part is that we can also be diagnosed with both. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we, are one or the other, but these different physiological states can very much affect our lived experience. The cognitive triangle is a really lovely CBT tool that I love using. And basically just understanding that dynamic between our thoughts, emotions, and our behaviors. In terms of our thoughts, we're always going to have automatic thoughts, our responses to situations, but then there are a lot of techniques that we can learn to use to respond differently to those initial automatic thoughts. And I mention that very specifically because when we don't understand that those automatic thoughts are always going to happen, whether we like it or not, we sometimes can be very hard on ourselves if we're trying to change some of those patterns. So the actual part that we have control over is the way we respond to our thoughts. So for example, if you have a pain signal and you have thoughts in your head to go, I don't think I can handle this anymore. The question is, are you going to believe that thought? Are you just going to give up and assume that that's correct, that you can't handle this anymore? Or are you going to acknowledge that you are, very tired and you need some rest, but maybe once you've rested, you might be able to handle more than you might imagine. So yeah, we can do a whole lot of stuff on that side of things. On the emotion side of the equation, we often experience them, and I think the emotions very much relate to that physiological experience. I've got another model now that does include that kind of physical side of things. Sometimes the emotional side, the chemicals, the neurotransmitters, all those things that I'm referring to really fall into that bucket. A lot of people would go and get things like anti-anxiety medication or antidepressants. But I think we also need to be very careful with that, because sometimes that in itself can just be treating the symptom and not actually looking at the underlying causes. And if we are taking, certain medications and the strategies we're using are kind of addictive, that can create knock-on effects and other problems. So we definitely want to still be very mindful about, utilizing other strategies than just, taking medication, although it can be an incredibly important part of the process for a lot of people at first. So it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just got to be carefully managed, and obviously by a doctor. I can't prescribe medication as a psychologist, but a really good GP hopefully would be able to give you something that can help. And that sometimes will help just make things a bit more manageable so you can get moving and get on your way. There's a lot of behavioral techniques as well. I'm going to cover a few of them in a sec, but some of those behavioral techniques are actually kind of designed to create and release some of those more positive chemicals in our brain. So we can develop a lot of different strategies from a behavioral perspective. And sometimes that's just learning to breathe very deeply. I know that sounds like very painfully obvious. Like you all know how to breathe. You're probably very good at it by this point in your life. But at the same time, there's effective ways to breathe that we can use to kind of, really deactivate our system. And one of those ways, there's a very lovely channel by a Stanford neuroscientist called Andrew Huberman, and he has incredible stuff. If you follow anyone for this kind of knowledge, he's a really great source to follow. And he talks about that. I think the research has shown that something called the psychological shrug is one of the best ways to really deactivate your system, which is basically taking sort of 3, breaths in, kind of holding it for a little bit, and then breathing it all the way out, and then just, emptying your lungs completely, and then doing that a few times. That's also one of the ways we can get our frontal lobe online if we are feeling panicked and anxious. And then, in terms of the situation, I just wanted to include this one as well, because those physical reactions can also be, important. And what's also I really like about this model is that it really demonstrates that all of these things can impact each other. So sometimes, going back to that threat resource model, sometimes the threat is a situation outside of us. Sometimes the threat is the thought we're having. Sometimes it is the feeling. If you don't know that your heart's beating faster because you are responding to to a situation as if it's a life and death threat, you might think you're having a heart attack, and then you might freak out more. And that's actually like, panic attacks in a sense are when we become, just kind of in this like loop, and kind of like we can develop anxiety about anxiety, and we just kind of, it spirals from there. Why is it difficult to manage? It can be a very much moving target, obviously, depending on the condition. Sometimes it can seem very insurmountable. It can be exhausting. A lot of the other reasons that I mentioned in the other slide. Just even getting a diagnosis can be a battle for some people, and then there's an ongoing effect to manage. So it's really, if you know someone with chronic pain and they are well enough to, please always ask them first, but, please give them a hug, because they might need it more than you know. Objective causes and subjective experiences, I think, is also really important. That, there might be like science, and there might be diagnoses, and there might be doctors who will know what, certain conditions, will look like from a symptomatic perspective. People also have their own subjective experiences, and sometimes we can underestimate things, sometimes we can overestimate things. I know of people that have ignored, like, a burst appendix to the point that they almost had very serious medical complications. So they were basically underestimating their pain experience. So, the subjective experience is very difficult to really pinpoint, because we can't really be in other people's minds. So comparing and really figuring out these things can be harder than it seems. Difficulty in knowing like when to rest and when to push. I think that's probably one of, like, if I can sum up one of the biggest challenges I've had, it's knowing when you really need to take, some time off and allow your body to heal and recuperate, and when you actually do need to focus on building strength and doing rehab and doing some exercise and getting moving, because if you don't do those things, it's just going to get, progressively more difficult, and you're going to lose strength, and then that's going to create more pain. So, that's a very, very difficult one to manage. And I really encourage if possible, to try and, get support on that, if you do have a healthcare professional as well who can weigh in, but calibrating that can be a very, very tricky, thing. The symptoms can be very resistant, it can be, a lot of the stuff can be very confusing. I make it sound simple, but I've been studying this for a very long time. It can be a lot more difficult, in practice, to actually apply it to your life. So that's important to remember. And then, the risks of avoiding the pain or killing the pain, especially with addictive things, can also be like another sort of dynamic where, you're managing the pain by taking a painkiller, but then you develop a dependence on it. And now that's another challenge that you've got to work on, because that is a whole nother, ball game that I don't have enough time to get into, but that can create another like level of challenge. And that, does also very much link to sort of dysfunctional maladaptive coping mechanisms that can create, whether it's the avoidance, whether it's, dissociating, there's a lot of different things that can make it difficult to actually treat the pain. So how can we manage it? I think the biggest thing is deciding to invest in, a journey of post-traumatic growth. We often talk about post-traumatic trauma, but trying to find a way to make meaning out of it, maybe for example, like talking to you about this and mentioning and being able to draw on my experience is one way that I've, found a way to do this, but really like trying to, making a decision that this isn't going to be, this isn't the story, this is the origin story. And is it your villain story or villain origin story, or is it your hero origin story? And I know that sounds a little bit cheesy, but I do think that is important to, to really think about. Changing your relationship with pain and discomfort, increasing your tolerance window, learning to sit with more pain for longer. I know that it's possible from experience. It's not easy, but there was a time where I didn't think I would ever handle certain things. And now, I handle it honestly better than I thought I would. And maybe there is sort of a degree of luck, and I have invested a lot in strength, but, we can learn to tolerate the pain itself in a different way. Through things like mindfulness, through things like meditation, having support structures is very important as much as possible. I know that that's not always in our control, but we really do need to ask for help. That was also a very hard part of my journey, but we need it. And including support structures that are going to hold us accountable and give us a hard time when we don't care for ourselves as we should. I think there is also a component to, to talk about around grieving and allowing ourselves to grieve. We're going to have moments where, we really are just having a bit of a pity party, and, we need to have spaces where we can process those emotions safely. The more we try and just bottle that up, that's where the escaping the pain comes in. And that's really hard because, sometimes our family doesn't always know that actually that's a very healthy thing for us to be actively grieving. They might feel overwhelmed and helpless as well. And then that might lead us not to speak to them. So but we've got to find ways to do it and heal it. We deserve it. And then self-care, exercise. Yoga is a really great form of exercise, because it does bring in a lot of the breathing, and really great for our nervous system, and just investing in deep breathing techniques as well. Very quickly, I know that I am a little bit over time already, but I think just one thing that's important to understand is that there are sort of roles, and these aren't people. We can have all of these three roles sort of internally to ourselves, but really understanding that, we can be in a very sort of victim and disempowered perspective, and we will have people in our lives that will enable that and kind of just try and rescue us. It can be with the best of intentions. They can be trying to help a lot of the time, but they can actually create more obstacles by, keeping us stuck in the problem. And then on the other hand, we might have people who just, can't handle it and try and whip us into shape and do it in a way that's very harsh. Also sometimes actually also with good intentions too. But on the flip side of that, we do have roles and approaches to the stuff that makes things a lot more sustainable and better in the long run, which is kind of becoming someone who is a creative solutions, not getting stuck in the victim mindset, but seeing ourselves as survivors, or hoping to one day see ourselves as survivors, as I think I do on most days, feel. And we do need people in our corner. So the people who might have been in the rescue role or enablers can very much be our supporters, that we need people in our corner. We do need help sometimes, but we also need the boundary setters who are going to help us, through accountability, who are going to tell us, that we need to go and get stuff done and get exercising and build strength. We also can engage in some therapies. I've mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, the triangle that I was referring to, understanding these, different dynamics and working on different areas. looking at the threat resource model, getting antidepressants if that is that what we need to for the emotional regulation side, getting rest if we're burnt out, if we're in a free state, learning how to activate ourselves through like healthy chemicals. And then, basically fight or flight. If we're in that space, if we're traumatized, we have to take a different response. We have to process that energy. There are also some DBT, distress tolerance techniques, that are also really great for that. So if you Google DBT distress tolerance techniques, you'll find quite a few resources on those. And then some cognitive techniques around our anxiety when our thoughts are just really bullying us and tricking us. This is a really lovely resource. There's many of these types of things, but looking for how we can stimulate those healthy chemicals through our behavior, through the tasks that we engage in. And then, very much looking at how we can manage pain, dialectical behavioral therapy, as I mentioned, and some of those distress tolerance techniques. The concept of radical acceptance, very, very briefly, separating out liking something from accepting it. We don't have to like something to accept it, but accepting it means that we've accepted the reality of it enough to actually move on and find solutions. It's not a perfect science as well. We will have moments, but just really at least separating out those things, that if we do accept something, it doesn't mean we like it. There's some really cool brain-based insights. Impact Therapy Center has some wonderful resources for professionals, some free resources, actually a wonderful training on pain that I also actually just loved and referred to a lot when I was thinking about this presentation. So there's some wonderful stuff out there. Acceptance and commitment therapy, also fantastic, learning to overcome our emotional avoidance. And then some bottom-up approaches. A lot of the things I've mentioned are kind of more talk therapies, top-down approaches. And when we talk about top-down and bottom-up, we're talking about the brain structures. Bottom-up approaches are really more addressing that autonomic and like the brainstem sort of responses, hypnosis, BWRT, EMDR, short-term ways that we can actually rewire our threat detection response, basically. And just left for the last slide, just a couple of books that are really great, sources if you want to read further into this. The Body Keeps a Score is a very famous book that has really changed our view on some of this stuff. Not to say that there aren't incredible people out there as well. Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, there's some wonderful research coming out that really informs a lot of the stuff that I've spoken about. And then, just two books also, if we really want to focus on building solutions, Man's Search for Meaning, if we want to find ways to, start building that meaning. He's just got an incredible story that I don't have a lot of time to get into, but please take my word for it that that's a book worth reading. And then Carol Dweck's Mindset, which is very much about helping us move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset and creating more options in our lives. That's me. Sorry, let me leave it on my last slide, but that's all I've got for you today.
The attempt to escape from pain is what creates more pain. I think that is my key takeaway from all of this, Claire. I think it's a loaded statement, and it goes so well with Kobus's comment in the chat box that says, it alludes to your earlier question that says that stoves are not always hot, but we remember that time we got burnt by a hot stove and now believe that stoves are always hot, causing us to miss many opportunities in life. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much, Claire, for delivering such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Before we close off, there are a couple of questions in the chat box for your attention. So I think we can quickly go through a couple of them.
Should I stop sharing?
It's okay. It's all right. You can leave it at my favorite quote.
Perfect.
All right. So
I love that comment. It definitely is, and it's so hard. Like, I think that's also part of the grieving, that we can't go back and take those opportunities back. And we can't judge ourselves back to a better space. The only way that we're going to get there is through compassion for ourselves. So I think forgiving ourselves for those missed opportunities and knowing that we couldn't have done anything differently, at the time. Now we might do better if we know better, but it is still very difficult. It's not a foolproof thing. Then we've got, what determines your threshold of pain? A lot of different things. As I mentioned, that very complex set of variables between your personality, your support system, what you've had modeled to you. If you've got parents who kind of we were very resilient, that might help you have those building blocks. So there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of, our starting threshold, but I think that's also where, the point is that it doesn't have to be an inevitable threshold. So we can very much learn. Like I definitely didn't have the same level of pain threshold that I now have when I was a lot younger. I would crumble at a lot less pain, or a lot less pain. Now, I've learned to just cope with a lot more, through things like mindfulness, like as I said, like your attention, not emphasizing it. Lots of different techniques can help just manage that relationship differently. Just go down.
Let me help you with that.
I think as more comments are coming in,
yes,
my scrolling is.
We have some more in the Q&A box that I have readily opened. So, Ntombikona would like to know what happens when someone feels the severe pain in their upper and lower back, but all tests come back clean. I'm not sure if that's something that you can answer, Claire.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely from like it's not within my scope of practice to specifically like diagnose like a specific pain, but I would definitely try to seek the different healthcare professionals might be able to give different insights. I can definitely relate to the bewildering element of not knowing what the cause is, and if you do go to healthcare professionals and they don't give you the answer, I found like going to things like physio had a huge effect on like things like muscles, even though my surgeon at one point didn't necessarily like specifically tell me to go there and do that. Other people prefer going to chiropractors. Like, there's a lot of different, medical professionals, and there's things like trauma release therapy, so that would be kind of, my encouragement. I know that that's easier said than done because there's not always a lot of resources. I certainly wouldn't have the resources to go to every, healthcare professional that I want to to investigate something, so I think that's a very, very difficult thing to do. But like to see if you can find like really good pain specialists and really do some research if you are able to get to somebody who can, really, really get into a diagnostic sort of side of things. But I definitely wouldn't be able to say exactly what that is. Sometimes like, people do experience, and like it has become a little bit of like a whole bucket, with fibromyalgia, as I mentioned, where people can get, just like pains in their body that don't have any sort of specific explanation. But I think, the most important thing is to, not to give up on yourself, and not to, to keep trying to find those solutions as much as possible. And, to really, as I said, like invest in self-care and stretching and things like that, not getting stuck in the pain if possible. Like I know if I don't do my stretches, it has a huge impact on like how I live every day. So those kind of things, how we manage our body and care for it is really important. Hot baths, putting heat on our body. No, but I think, as I said, like getting to the right professionals who can tell you when to put the heat on and when to put the cold on. I certainly wouldn't be an expert in that particular area.
Thanks for that, Claire. And then Wanda would like to know how to help someone who is going through painful events but yet in denial.
Oh, that's a hard one. Denial is a defense mechanism, that defense, like it's a huge defense mechanism to protect ourselves from a certain reality. I think the biggest thing, it completely depends on the perspective of the person, trying to help them. You can't necessarily break through the denial. All that loved ones can really do is with love, and trying not to do it in a way that is too harsh. It really is an art, to confront people in loving ways, but to point out, what the behavior or whatever is causing them. And I can certainly say, like, for me, I had two people in my life because there was a time where I just really was not getting moving. Like I was very, stuck. I was very depressed in it. And, basically, like, I think that they both kind of in a very, like, they both managed to do it very sensitively, but they kind of said, like, I can't watch you do this, like I love you too much to watch you do this. And if this is what you're going to do, then I'm not going to, kind of stick around. So if you want me in your life, please, will you invest in your health? Please, will you prioritize yourself? And that definitely helped me a lot more. I would say it's not to say that the people who were, being supportive in my life weren't being, very helpful in other ways, but they were sometimes, kind of enabling me when I think that's the problem is like when someone's really struggling, when they're very vulnerable, because I was once that person, can behave in like quite manipulative ways. It's very hard to know the difference between an excuse and a reason, not to do something. And I had a lot of people who would step in and help me with those things, and it kind of disempowered me more because I didn't actually have to do it for myself. So, just sometimes, like that can sometimes be, because I did see also somebody saying like finding that line between, just setting that boundary, just learning to say, like I want to help you, but I want to help you do what you can't do, not what you can do, So maybe very, very quickly, a metaphor that I often talk about is when I was doing dancing growing up, I used to dance in pointe shoes, and my mom always used to sew my pointe shoes, which I always loved and appreciated. And I used to like look at my other friends, and they were, sewing their pointe shoes themselves, and I would say, oh, shame, man, their moms obviously are so busy or they can't help them. And that was all great and well until I kind of reached my 20s, and I was like, I have no idea how to sew. And I kind of wished in some ways that she had, maybe taken a step back and at some point said, I want to help you learn to sew. Like, I will help you learn. I'm not going to let you, break your ankle because you do not know how to sew your pointe shoe right now. I'm going to show you, I'm going to teach you, and then you're going to start to do it more and more and more until you've actually learned the skill. But at the same time, I think, you also can't make somebody do it for themselves. Like, I can make excuses about how my mom, with all her love, deprived me of an opportunity to learn how to sew pointe shoes, but I can at some point also go and get myself empowered. I can learn how to do it myself. So yeah, I think we can create the conditions for somebody to empower themselves. But it is a very, very fine line to draw. Like, I think it is a very hard, balance to find between supporting somebody and going too far in a way that kind of prevents them from building themselves.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that very informative answer. I think that's a question that really came up in the chat box, that line between being an enabler and being a supportive structure for someone dealing with chronic pain.
And you also have to look after yourself as a caregiver, like, I think that's also the thing. Like, you can't help everyone all the time. You can't be there for everyone all the time. Like, you also have your own stress and health to kind of manage. And that's also such a hard thing because, when someone's really struggling, sometimes you do need to make sacrifices to show up for them. But, at the same time, like, we have to, the only person that we can ever truly fully care for is ourselves, and sometimes, and I think that's kind of where like my empowerment came in, because my family loved me and they couldn't do those things for me. So if I appreciated the help that they gave me and loved them, then I could, find those solutions and build that strength so that, they didn't have to worry so much about me. And I think that's a really huge love language, caring for ourselves because we care about other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Before I get into the next question, colleagues, the presentation and the recording will be shared with you within 5 days after this webinar. So please be on the lookout in your emails that you've provided when you were registering for the webinar. So it will definitely be shared with you. I can get into the next question now, and then I think it's time for us to close. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. But Precious would like to know, she says that her question relates to a common presentation of suicide being a response to emotional and cognitive pain. In the same way, suicide is seen to numb or end the pain. Others struggle from chronic suicidality, which can be equated as chronic pain to an individual. Again, mental health care users would present with self-harm, wrist cuts to be specific. Anything you can say around that? And would you mind sharing any possible preventative suggestions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, and I also watched, I also saw another comment about somebody who's has a colleague with some very tragic experiences. And I think that's also where, bringing the right healthcare professionals in is so critical. And I know that that's also like a moving target. Not everyone has all the same resources, but you can't always manage those things on your own, and really doing what you can to try and get someone that support is often like the most helpful thing that you can do. But also, we can also lend an ear, we can also be there, to support. Sometimes just giving someone a space to be sad and cry it out, is also helpful, but it should probably be both in an ideal world, that they have somebody who really is trained to help responsibly and ethically is a big thing. And yeah, just to come back to the question around suicide, absolutely, it's a very misunderstood condition. A lot of people have at some point, experienced, thoughts of suicide without actually acting on it. So the thoughts in of themselves are quite a normal thing. And there's a lot of research that the way that we believe and react to those thoughts is actually a huge, like a factor in the vicious cycles developing, or seeking help and support. For example, if you're having thoughts like that, then that doesn't mean that you're inevitably going to go down a very dark path. It means that you need to get help and talk to somebody and get some support. It's obviously very difficult when you are treating people kind of in that space, and again, referring to the right context is very important. Like, when I've got clients, like, we can do things like discuss safety, risk assessments and things like that. But I can't, I know that I've got to refer to a facility, like an emergency room if it's like very urgent, or a psychiatric facility, like I can't necessarily manage that risk on my own. So wherever possible, if that's the case, I think that's a really important thing to do, is refer to, psychiatrists and people, doctors who can treat it. Just also very quickly on the cutting thing though, I think it's also like a behavior that can also be, have a range of different sort of focus points and different needs that you're trying to meet. Obviously, like, some people might harm themselves with that intention, to kind of escape the pain in a very permanent way, which is obviously very tragic and so often impulsive. I think that's the thing, is a lot of research has shown that a lot of people who do make a decision like that, an impulsive decision, might not necessarily be making a rational one, and not one that they would make in a more rational moment. Obviously, though, it can still be very permanent and damaging. So, we do need to take it very seriously. It was actually Suicide Prevention or Awareness Day on Tuesday. So it's a very topical week to be talking about it. But also with cutting, it can sometimes also be a way to stimulate those natural painkillers. So that is something that, I think is often misunderstood with cutting. It doesn't mean it's acceptable. It's very dangerous. It's very harmful on so many levels. You can get infections, and it's not a healthy, coping mechanism, to say the least. But one thing that is quite interesting is that often, like, people are actually feeling very numb and either just trying to feel something, even if it's pain, or, are actually looking for those endorphins and that natural painkiller effect that gets released when we experience pain.
Thanks, Claire. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Ms. Claire Myhill's exploration of the intricate relationship between mental health and chronic pain. And I think I speak on behalf of all the participants who joined today that you've definitely shed light on a topic that is often misunderstood and overlooked. And there's always something special that comes from our lived experiences. So thank you very much for sharing your lived experience with us of dealing with chronic pain. Thank you very much, Claire. Once again, we hope to have you for another webinar with us.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining. Any final words from you, Claire, before we close?
Just please have a good evening. Please get some rest, and please care for yourselves.
Awesome. Thank you. You heard that, ladies and gents. Thank you and good night.